movement. As India commemorates the 75th anniversary of its independence, the question of citizenship and who belongs to today's India has been at the center of debate. This debate was triggered by the passing of the Citizenship Amendment Act, CAA, by Parliament in 2019, December 2019. Equal citizenship is the bedrock of democracy. The new law, however, disregards this basic principle by excluding a sizable section of the population from the structure of citizenship by making legal a ranking by religion of refugees and immigrants. It seeks to redefine who is an Indian, and this can potentially redefine Indian nationhood. Now, this provoked unprecedented protests throughout India. So the question that we need to consider is what explains the scale and magnitude of protests around this issue? How and why did it become a nationwide movement? Why did Muslim women, which is my central concern this evening, play leadership roles? In fact, many have even called it essentially a women's protest because women were so prominent. They were really in the leadership, not just in the forefront, but they were in the leadership of the movement. I will discuss three critical factors that coalesced to make this moment and movement significant and seem to have drawn women to this movement. Now, at stake in these equal citizenship protests was the secular spirit of the Indian Constitution, as opposed to the majoritarian narrative espoused by the ruling dispensation to redefine secular India as a Hindu nation. These protests challenged this agenda with a sustained focus, and this is very important, with a sustained focus on constitutionalism, inclusive and secular nationalism. The Constitution, it must be noted, loomed large in these protests, and it was the first time that people used the Constitution so extensively to claim equal rights. And secondly, and very importantly, this movement was not a Muslim movement as is commonly believed. This movement had the support of a variety of people from very different backgrounds. No doubt Muslims dominated in terms of numbers because they were the people most affected by the CAA. But significantly, this was not a Muslim movement. Now, notwithstanding the varied support structure, it was seen, as I just mentioned, it was seen as a Muslim movement which disregarded the broad-based structure of its support. I argue that reducing the equal citizenship protest to merely Muslims and their rights is to discount and disregard the pluralism of protests and the new grammar of democratic assertion and collective action that emerged to oppose majoritarian politics of division and polarization. Now, women were in the forefront of the resistance to the new citizenship law, sometimes leading from the front and sometimes from the margins. They made their presence felt in public spaces in ways that connected them to the wider democratic struggles, and their widespread presence could just not be ignored. Between December 2019 and March 2020, when this campaign ended, women led 426 protests. Women led or participated in 426 protests that had taken place. These included 87 women-led protest marches, 119 women-led rallies, and 229 women's sit-ins, among others. Now, of all of these, of course, Shaheen Bagh protests were undoubtedly the most significant. Uh, and of course, the Shaheen Bagh protest, as is well known, was largely organized, led, and sustained by Muslim women who previously did not have an autonomous or significant presence in public protests across India. Shaheen Bagh propelled the anti-CAA mobilization, but it was itself propelled by the student agitation at Jamia Millia Islamia University in Delhi, just a few kilometers away from Shaheen Bagh. The sit-in gained strength from its proximity to Jamia Millia and the intellectual and social heft it provided. Jamia Millia's reputation as a liberal, progressive institution contributed to the breadth and inclusiveness of Shaheen Bagh. The contrast with protests in East Delhi underlines this. In the latter two, there were large sit-ins, occupy type sit-ins, which continued for over a month, but they were confined to a working class area, which was easier to isolate and neutralize and easier for the police to deal with quite harshly. Whereas the Shaheen Bagh's proximity to Jamia Millia, together with the presence of students from Jamia Millia, Jawaharlal Nehru University, and Delhi University, lent it a certain weight and significance. So I argue then that Jamia Millia played a crucial role in generating the initial momentum for the mobilization against CAA, and more especially to Shaheen Bagh. It became the central metaphor, that Shaheen Bagh became the central metaphor for nationwide mobilization against the Citizenship Amendment Act. It became central to the public discourse because Shaheen Bagh, even though it was an Occupy movement, was not really confined to the distinctive cultural and political conditions of the locality, because people were gravitating to Shaheen Bagh from different parts of the city, indeed, from different parts of the country. So the sheer presence of women in such large numbers and for such a long period, as you know, the Shaheen Bagh protest lasted for 101 days. So the sheer presence of women in such large numbers and for such a long period questioned the dominant discourse about Muslim women that they lack agency and are oppressed by the male members of their family. Shaheen Bagh was a powerful symbol of peaceful civil disobedience and strength in the face of prejudice, hate, and discrimination. This had a ripple effect with numerous protests popping up in the city and across India. In fact, Shaheen Bagh inspired Shaheen Bagh-like protests in many parts of the country. So Shaheen Bagh sort of popped up not just in Delhi, but in different cities across the country. Now, the presence of Muslim women in public spaces was quite extraordinary. It reconfigured these public spaces, which in the past may have been hostile public spaces, as inclusive and democratic sites of participation. The substantial presence of women in this movement was undoubtedly the most noteworthy aspect. A very large number of women broke the class, gender, and religio-cultural ceilings to reclaim political space in the Republic. Their message was clear. It is imperative to defend the constitutional values of equal rights, secularism, and participatory democracy through collective public action. as it turned out, women came to dominate these gatherings and men literally took a back seat. And very many women said in interviews to the press and also in Shaheen Bagh that they were not there because their men had asked them to come. They were there voluntarily and of their own will and interest. Now, the nature of the new citizenship law and how it would affect ordinary people was clear to everyone present in the protest. What was also evident was that this was a campaign that was not about the Muslim community, it was not about community or religion. The active participation of Muslim women was no doubt an important feature of this movement, and they sustained it in multiple locations, and no one would have expected such significant participation of Muslim women. And above all, they were able to, in a way, bust many stereotypes. Typically, Muslim women had been dismissed as oppressed and denigrated, but they were now asserting their right to participation. They were asserting equal rights. Now, a significant feature, as I just mentioned, a significant feature of their participation was the absence of community-specific positions. When women demanded azadi, they demanded it for all women, irrespective of religion. When they called for the repeal of CAA and NRC, they included all citizens, not just Muslim, noted feminist author Ritu Menon quite rightly. These demands cannot therefore be viewed merely in terms of community affiliation, notwithstanding that there were more Muslim women than women from other communities. Yet it was not about Muslim women per se or about the community that they belonged to. So participation in this movement opened a new world for women in which they were seen, heard, and taken seriously. These demonstrations gave them a voice and agency which had hitherto been lacking. Most importantly, because it was not community specific, it enabled a discussion of wider issues which contributed to a broadening of the concept of rights. In contrast, during the Shabano protests in the late 1980s, Muslim women were prominent, but most of them had come out at the call of clerics. This time, as in Kanpur, women protested in defiance of clerical advice. Very many clerics asked them during the anti-CAA movement to go back home and so on. In fact, one of the religious leaders who tried to end the dharna or the demonstration in Kanpur was perplexed as to why Muslim women were not listening to them. And he was perplexed about the fact that women were not listening to them. And he said earlier people would listen to Qazi, but now people are calling us Dallals and Mukhbirs. I cannot understand why they are not listening to us. I think this, in a way, sums up very eloquently the difference between Muslim women's participation in the Shabano agitation, that is those who were supporting, that is those who were opposing the Shabano verdict, and Muslim women now opposing the CAA. So this mobilization has shown that Muslim women can speak for themselves and also for others. Many dared to speak, notwithstanding the risk of facing vilification or boycott for disagreeing with the dominant narrative. For many women then, this was a life-changing experience, a life-changing event, as they were standing up for a cause larger than themselves. So it politicized women in a way that had not happened earlier, and certainly not during the Shabano agitation. Now, what explains women's participation? There were many reasons which propelled women to occupy the streets. For a start, it has something to do with more women entering schools, colleges, and workspaces, including Muslim women, and more women leaving their homes in small towns for education and work in large cities, which offer greater freedom, exposure, and the camaraderie and friendship of other women outside their families. According to the All India Survey on Higher Education for 2016-17, women constitute 48.6% of the total enrollment in colleges and universities. And this is likely to have gone up to 48, 49%. It's probably half and half now. Women opposed to the CA opposed the CA because it posed a threat of disenfranchisement, detention, and deportation, or at least they feared so. There were genuinely felt fears of losing citizenship. Many of them felt that they would bear the burden of proving that they are not from neighboring countries, such as Pakistan or Bangladesh. And images and reports of detention camps in Assam and so on had a chilling effect on many of them. With the result, many women began sensing and experiencing the fear or the potential fear of being disenfranchised. It is well known, and it has been argued by so many commentators and during the course of this campaign that clearly the CAA threatens women more than men and poor more than others. At a practical level, women are likely to suffer disproportionately from the CAA and the NRC, or the National Register of Citizens, which require documents that most of them are unlikely to possess. This is because women generally tend to have less documentation and are thus excluded from the ambit of public life and often ignored by the administration. With relatively lower literacy rates than men, and in the absence of land ownership, most women lack the documentation they need, specifically education certificates and land titles and so on. They're also likely to change their surnames and move from their place of birth when they marry. Many women have only a vague idea of where and when they were born, and even if they have documentation, do not travel with it. These women were therefore clear that the demand by the state that every individual produce documents proving the date and place of their parents' or ancestors' birth was unreasonable. The third aspect, I mentioned in the beginning that I'm going to be discussing three aspects. So it's the first was not about community, and then education and mobility, and the third is home and the nation. Now, the noteworthy aspect of this protest was that women were fashioning and responding to challenges as they went along. The home and the nation are the two strongest bases of shelter, security, and identity for a human being. Many women felt that CA would rob them of both. They know intuitively what it means to be displaced, to be rendered homeless. Repeated and egregious references to partitions, unfinished business, revive fears of displacement that wreaks havoc on women. Changes in the citizenship law, they felt, would deprive them of their basic rights. For them, citizenship is not merely the right to vote. It is much deeper than political rights or voting alone. It is embedded in birthright. It is this fundamental notion of citizenship that women seek to reclaim, the idea of citizenship as a birthright. Thus, women were vocal in asserting their sense of belonging to the nation based on their deep association with this land, the land of their birth. They repeatedly said at different protest sites that they belong here as much as others. So this movement then linked their attachment to the land, to their identities, histories, and imagined futures. One of the women who spearheaded the Park Circus protest in Calcutta evoked the Rowlatt Act of 1919, and she said, as Gandhi had declared, a struggle for Azadi in 1919, and the chance of freedom rent every part of this country. So we too have declared Azadi now, the freedom to lay claim to our own land. This was so beautifully said by this activist. This remarkable struggle indeed reminds us of the freedom struggle, of India's freedom struggle, when large numbers of women responded to Mahatma Gandhi's call to participate in the national movement. Women from all backgrounds came out on the streets to lend support to the national movement at crucial moments. In August 1942, Gandhi gave his final call to the nation to rise up against the British at Govalia Tank Maidan in Bombay, now Mumbai. When the Quit India movement began, the British arrested Gandhi and other prominent Congress leaders. It was the young freedom fighter Aruna Safali who promptly unfurled the national flag at the Govalia Tank Maidan on 9th August in a powerful, emotive act of protest before going underground. In the weeks that followed, women played a significant role in continuing the Quit India movement. However, and that is the very important point. I made a comparison with the Shabano agitation and said how the anti-CA movement was different. And indeed, even though the anti-CA movement evokes the freedom struggle, yet the equal citizenship movement was different from the freedom struggle in the sense that there was no male leader steering people's opposition or women's opposition. This time, women were not responding to the call of male leaders. They were indeed leaders in their own right, and significantly, they had the support of their families. Now, the centrality of women in these protests complicates then the reductive stereotypes that define the reality of Indian women in general and Muslim women in particular. The involvement of Muslim women in this battle was as necessary and powerful as the participation of all socially marginalized groups and the privileged, and yet it is women whose presence was most felt and lent salience to the protests. They challenged through their modes of organizing the dominant cultural codes relating to community, gender relations, and hierarchies. Their large presence challenged the commonly observed trends of women's participation both in politics and in public life. This movement demonstrated that the state can be challenged and that the constitutional values of secularism, equality, and participatory democracy can be defended by collective action of the most disempowered. So in conclusion then, the anti-CAA protest was significant because it occurred at a time when the very idea of dissent and protest had been systematically discredited and seen to be detrimental to national interest. And indeed, the anti-CAA movement was declared by the powers that be as an anti-national exercise or movement. So the anti-CAA protest was significant, as I said, because it occurred at a time when protests had been sort of declared to be anti-national. Now, the large numbers of people and women in particular who joined the protests served as a reminder that it is nearly impossible to stamp out dissent in India. And this is so significant in the 75th year of our independence, when we are celebrating the 75th year of our independence. This was indeed a tribute to Indian independence and to Indian secularism and pluralism and the pressing need for tolerance. So the anti-CAA protests gave a new lease of life to Indian secularism which with all its weaknesses, and we have all noted, commented, spoken, written about its weaknesses, yet this movement showed that secularism, with all its blemishes, remains a powerful ideological force enabling mass resistance against the right. And Indian politics has clearly moved to the right. Now, these protests were an important reminder that there cannot be meaningful democracy where people do not have equal rights and equal citizenship unfettered by religion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Hasan. That was so illuminating. I think what you said about the importance of talking about dissent, marking the 25 years of Indian independence, I think a country born out of dissent, and now there is our sort of powers to be, as you said, stamping out dissent is pretty significant to comment on. And thank you for also tracing the history, the genealogy of Shaheen Bagh protests and the ways in which it differs, and it sort of stands on the shoulders of previous movements. I think it's significant to remark, as you did, the sort of advancements we've had in women's education and that building of community, and how even though it was still mesmerizing to watch women occupying public space, it was possible because of the moment in which it was happening, and in previous years it might not have been so. So it's also important to sort of remember sort of advancements that have been made in the name of secularism and in the name of women's education and sort of the women's mobility and gendered mobility advancing, and how that really contributed to the scale that Shaheen Bagh sort of reached. I have many questions, but I would like to reserve them for the end. Thank you so much once again. That was a brilliant talk. For now, we'll move on to our other speakers. Thank you. Next, we have Safa P, who's from Kerala, an independent researcher in Mapela Women in Malabar, the Muslim women of Southern Kerala, working in the Gender Data Center, Gender Park, under the Department of Social Justice, Kerala. She holds an MA in Sociology from JNU and a bachelor's degree in Sociology from Farooq College, Calicut. Her current interest in research revolves around the political subjectivity of Muslim women and their engagement with the state in the context of the 1921 Malabar Rebellion. And she also works as a research fellow on the same under the Girls Islamic Organization of Kerala. She's recently received an acceptance letter to start her MA in Modern Indian Studies from CMIS, I hope that's right, University of Göttingen in Germany. So congratulations on that. And thank you so much for joining us. If you would like to share your screen, go ahead. If not, I'm happy to also do that for you.
Thank you. I don't have a screen, like PowerPoint. Okay, is it
That's
okay?
completely fine. Yeah, take it away.
Okay. Am I audible? Am I perfect? Okay. Thank you so much to the organizers and all. Seeing the very prominent scholars in panels, I am from yesterday, I'm a little bit overwhelmed, and to be honest, a little bit afraid too. I hope that would count.
You're fine. Don't worry about it. You're fine.
Okay. So the title of my paper is Muslim Women and Social Formation of 1921 Malabar, a Decolonial Analysis. So Ayush Qureshi in his book, Muslim Community of Indo-Pakistan Subcontinent, begins the historical study of Islam in India by examining the developments in South India. The geographical isolation kept Kerala out of the complex political environment of northern India, keeping the social structure of the region unique. The direct and permanent contact of Arab with the Malabar coast played a very crucial role in the cultural, economic, political, ideological developments of the Mapilas of Malabar. The European invasion of Malabar The northern part of Kerala, like everywhere else in the world, made the social life and economic activities of people in Malabar difficult for a long time, forcing the Mappilas to undertake centuries of resistance. In each period, strong leaders and ulamas who lent political and ideological support emerged to strengthen this resistance. This paper specifically discusses the role of Mappila women in 1921 Mappila uprising in Malabar. It is a very important period in the history of Indian freedom struggle that a whole community who lived under British oppression for centuries came to the front of the fight with a strong ideological base and courage. We see international news agencies in 1920s reported the Malabar struggle with great importance. This rebellion can be analyzed as a transnational chapter in India's freedom struggle for various reasons. The colonial narratives and historical records cleverly tried to conceal the anti-imperialist and religious liberation aspect of Malabar struggle by mentioning it as a riot or communal conflict. The constant use of terms such as fanatics has led to the formation of the violent Malabar Mappila, which has gained wide acceptance. The nationalist narratives of Malabar struggle can be traced back to this. The Marxist historical narratives reduced Malabar rebellion as class struggle, negating the largest context of colonialism, caste, and religiosity that has played an important role in the uprising of 1921 Malabar. Subsequently, Kerala Renaissance also denied Malabar's contribution to the political and social formation of Kerala society. B.S. Sharin, in her work Gendering Minorities, talks about the attitude of the renowned Nambudiri reformer in Kerala towards the Muslim women. He has written different analogies about the Muslim women who is being suppressed by Muslim men and her religion and could only be emancipated by upper caste men. This is an upper caste male fantasy that enables them to have a moral upper hand over Muslim men and women to justify violence and discrimination against them. These notions of uncivilized that we had already seen in colonial narratives, Muslims have made it nearly impossible to talk about the contribution of Muslims, specifically of Muslim women from Malabar in the socio-political formation of Kerala. A decolonial analysis of the contribution of Mappila women in 1921 Malabar rebellion should be put forward, where a huge gap can be identified. The role of Muslim women in the socio-political formation of 1921 Malabar can be arguably identified and read as a part of the reformist modernist movement in Kerala if examined closely without falling for the stereotypical framework. The critique to colonial narrative can be extended to Kerala modernity as well, which denied the role and agency of Mappila women of Malabar. Thus, there is an urgent need to study the role of Muslim women in building up the early 1900s Malabar when men were mostly absent, martyred, deported, imprisoned, or denied contact with their families. The 1921 rebellion had affected the Muslims of Malabar in different ways. Hundreds of men and women were martyred, properties damaged, families extinguished. The community was socially, economically destroyed. A community from the brink of complete destruction has had to fight many battles to survive. It is in this context that it becomes important to mark the contribution of Muslim women in these fights and in enabling the process of building up 1921 Malabar community. R.H. Hitchcock, the district police officer of Malabar during 1921, argues that Mappila women were dangerous as they were sending even children to battlefield, and it is Mappila women who ignited the enthusiasm of Mappila men. He observes that fanatical urge among Mappila men waned outside Malabar after the Mancheri Payanad encounter of 1896, and it was because the rebellion outside of Malabar did not influence women to the same extent as men. For following up on Hitchcock's comment, evidence can be found about Mappila women's greater influence on the political appraisal of 1921 Malabar than is currently known. Narayana Menon, a police officer in his report submitted to the DSP on the Pukotur War, says that when the men of Pukotur went into battle, the Mappila women encouraged them and recited Badr Bait and Badr al-Kubra, watching the men fighting in the battlefield. The British record shows that there was a woman dressed as a man among the martyrs of Pukotur battle. Mappila women had successfully dealt with the economic needs of the families scattered after rebellion, engaged with the colonial state, adapted to the new political and social change, held religiosity, documented and passed on the history of the struggle, and built patriotism in successor generation. The women's oral narrative, which is called Vamoli in Malayalam, about the battles, the leaders, and the life and struggles of the community has served an important data in bringing a vivid picture of the social life of that time to the successors. The ethnic cleansing of British Army, which took place in different parts of Malabar following the resistant effort against the British oppressive system, upset the social order of Malabar. Innocent men were bayoneted to death by British troops. Mappila women were humiliated and hacked to death. Children and old people were brutally murdered. Historian M.P.S. Menon describes one of the events of that period as follows. The British Army looted all the houses in Manjeri. The women and children were killed. Women were raped and their stomachs were cut open. The police attacked all the Mappila families in Manjeri. They burned all the Mappila houses there. Masjids were demolished. It goes on. Men leave their houses, designating women to manage household to become martyrs with the assurance that they will never come back. These women did various jobs to support their family. Also, they have made many sacrifices to deliver food and messages to rebels in hiding. The women and children announced the arrival of the British Army to the whole village by shouting in a special voice. When there was a situation where all the men were shot from house to house, the women bravely faced that. Adolescents, boys were rescued by making dressed up as girls and sitting among women. Mappila women had the strength to stand unarmed in front of the army with such a great courage. The news report published by the New York Times on November 22, 1921 about the Wagon Massacre, the women's participation in the Battle of Pukotur was mentioned as the women too are fearless, often dashing out under heavy Lewis machine gun fire to rescue their relatives. It can be seen in the colonial records that Mappila women shown similar courage while Adigarathodu massacre was happened, which is a village in Malabar. They tried to prevent army from dragging their loved ones out of their houses and shooting them in their backyards with all their courage. An 11-year-old girl, Fatima, and another girl, Kadiamu, were two girls who became martyrs, trying to save their fathers from this genocide. Fatima hugged her father to resist the soldiers who dragged him out of the house and shot him. Kadiamu lied on her father, who was bedridden due to senile ailment, to resist shooting. Both were martyred together. When hundreds were shot dead in the backyards of the house, the women dug themselves and buried the martyrs there. Kunyai Shuma, the mother of Varyankunnatha Kunyahamata Haji, and his wife Malu Hajuma are just examples of Mappila women's bravery. Malu Hajuma was an active presence in the struggle along with Kunyahamata Haji, the brain of Malabar rebellion, who established a self-rule for 6 months. Malu Hajuma, riding on a horse, who always carried a knife around her waist, constantly convinced Mapala women the need for continuing the battle against British and feudal state. The ethnic cleansing carried out by the British Army had far-reaching effects. 1,200 were martyred, 50,000 were arrested, and 400 were court-martialed and sentenced to death or exile. This is just colonial records. R.H. Hitchcock himself acknowledged that brave Mapila women overcame the post-revolutionary situation by defying British prejudices. Mapila women who had never been outside of their taluk traveled alone by bus and train to meet their husbands and brothers who were in prison far away and to proceed court cases. He admits that these women developed the ability to lead their own families independently in the absence of their husbands and fathers and other male members in the family. Mapila women were constantly engaged with the colonial state. It was these women who constantly brought the case in the British court on behalf of their men who were jailed, deported, or never got any information sometimes about what happened to them. The Othupallikudams, the early form of today's school, were taken over by the Mapila women and successfully ran. The role of these Othupallikudams was not only limited in providing livelihood for the teachers, rather it played a crucial role in molding a community which has strong ideological base and political sensitivity. Kerala modernity perpetuated the lie that Mapila women, that Mapila women were illiterate. The Arabi Malayalam, a parallel language formed by Mapilas as their own long before the formation of current standardized Malayalam, was very well versed by Mapila women also. Even when women in other communities in Kerala were not exposed to literature, Mapila women read many books which were printed in Arabi Malayalam, taught many of them, and wrote beautiful poems and prose in the same blended language. To conclude, Islam in the 1921 Malabar was never a pre-modern, as colonial discourse branded. The modernity of Mapila women was not always connected with the colonial modernity or nationalism. Rather, it was a transnational experience for them. The role played by the land of Malabar and its women is not small in transferring the political sensitivity that is strongly rooted in their religiosity and piety as a modern experience from generation to generation, and in inspiring movements, including the citizenship movements in contemporary India. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was the talk that taught me a lot that I didn't know, which often happens, especially with not just Muslim women's sort of movements and resistance and rebellions, but also I think from the south, from the Malabar region, from Kerala, it's really important to sort of shine light on these issues. And I think you perhaps, I don't know if you attended yesterday's talk by Professor Sharon, but it was also talking about this, and there was a lot in there that I, again, learned a lot of, and I'm interested in listening to her book, reading her book, Gendering Minorities. So thank you so much. Again, we'll talk more at the Q&A section, but I'm going to call on our next speaker, Mridula Sharma, who is, I hope she's here.
Yes.
Amazing. Thank you. So Mridula Sharma is also an independent researcher. She's published over 20 journal articles and book chapters in edited anthologies published by Routledge, University of Delaware Press, and Vernon Press, among others. She has secured scholarships and grants for her work by institutions in Germany, England, India, and the US. Her research interests include critical theory, modernity, and pedagogy. So thank you so much for joining us, Mridula. I'm just going to read out the title of your paper, which is Commodifying Post-Colonial and Feminist Reason, Modern Narratives of Faith, Gender, and Law. If you'd like to share your screen, please go ahead. If not, let me know and I can do that for you.
Yes, I'd like to share my screen, and as I do that, also want to apologize in advance for any internet-related concerns that may crop up during the presentations. I'm very sorry for that, and yeah, I hope you can bear with me for some time. Okay, so my paper is titled "For Modifying Post-Colonial and Feminist Reason: Modern Narratives of Faith, Gender, and Law." I want to start by talking about the construction of landscapes of Islamophobia across the country by both the state and the public. In January 2022, 6 students in Karnataka were refused entry in the classroom because their hijabs violated the junior college's uniform policy. Counter protests were staged by Hindu students who demanded the recognition of their right to wear saffron scarves in the wake of emergent conversations on uniform policy. The counter protests didn't accompany or complement Muslim students' demand to wear a hijab. Instead, they were aligned in opposition to protests for institutional acceptance of the hijab. The ban was upheld by the court in Karnataka. In March 2022, a district court in Delhi granted bail to the 2 men accused of creating apps that hosted photos of Muslim women in a fake online auction. Bulli Bai and Sulli Deals creators were given bail on quote-unquote humanitarian grounds. Around the same time, the Delhi High Court returned its verdict on a plea that sought to initiate criminal proceedings against Anurag Thakur and Parvesh Verma for hate speech made prior to the 2020 Northeast Delhi riots targeting Muslims. Presided by Justice Chandradhari Singh, the single judge bench recorded, and I quote, if you're saying something offensive, if you're saying something with a smile, then there is no criminality. If you're saying something offensive, then definitely, unquote. State action against Indian Muslims does not exist in isolation. It has prompted an active public investment in the cultivation of an atmosphere of fear and humiliation for Muslims. In December 2021, for instance, Yati Nar Singhanand Giri helped organize Dharam Sansad or religious parliament events in BJP-led Uttarakhand, where he urged Hindu attendees to arm themselves for a quote-unquote genocide against Muslims. Attendees didn't protest the call to arms, and in April 2022, the Delhi police, which conducted an investigation in Dharam Sansad events organized in both Delhi and Uttarakhand, predictably concluded before the Supreme Court that it did not find any evidence of hate speech in the two events. The public's silent complicity and at times proactive investment in the state's orwellian agendas signals a dangerous precedent that illustrates the increasing normalization and acceptance of Islamophobic violence enacted under the falsified threat of Hindu victimhood. Armed mobs invoking the Hindu god Ram by repeatedly chanting Jai Shri Ram during Ramadan encapsulates the extent to which overt acts of violence targeting Muslims have become quotidian. In my presentation, I hope to foreground S.N. Balagangadhara's insistence on equating quote-unquote Islamic colonialism with British colonial rule in India, and Sanjay Dikshit's justification of the unconstitutional abrogation of Article 317 Kashmir to explore how new mechanisms of commodification of post-colonial and feminist reason function in Modi's Hindutva India. In Crisis from Orientalism, Edward Said underlines two situations that favor a textual attitude, one which assumes that the reality that humans inhabit can be understood on the basis of books. Confrontation with an unknown reality and appearance of success guides such an attitude. To understand the former, we can reflect on how travel books tend to acquire greater authority than the actuality that they intend to represent. The latter can be understood with Said's example of a lion book that paints lions as fierce. So if we read a book stating that lions are fierce and then end up encountering a fierce lion, we will be inclined to read more books by the same author and prompt the author to reinforce their knowledge in other kinds of written performance, such as a series of books dedicated to the same subject. S.N. Balagangadhara's What Does It Mean to Be Indian creates the conditions suitable for the second situation that Said describes. Balagangadhara begins with the assertion that Indians are, quote-unquote, the products of two colonialisms, the Islamic and the British. He positions Islamic rule in India not a mere foreign rule, but a colonization of India, because Islam did not remain foreign to the society it ruled. He adds, and I quote, instead, it interacted with the society and culture in multiple ways, impacting the culture and being impacted in turn, unquote. A persistent emphasis on the penetration of Islamic themes into the ideational world of Indians with the use of Indian terms and words positions Islam as a driver of violence, as though the textual roots and common practice of Islam by Islamic rulers exercises an inevitable influence on the manner in which they rule. Attempts to seek religious or cultural modes of explanation commonly mobilize and arrest public imagination when the conversation is centered around Islam. In Do Muslim Women Need Saving, Ayla Abu Lughod points out that the consistency with which news programs resort to the cultural instead of political or historical explanations in context concerning Islam is rather concerning. By problematizing Islamic rule in India with an anti-colonial rhetoric, Bal Gangadhara weaponizes the post-colonial establishment from which he repeatedly purports to depart to offer a different approach, and then attributes to Islamic rule the denial of experience. Now, since the fault has been located in the very logic of Islam, it is conveniently implied that a practitioner of Islam is reminiscent of Islamic colonialism that, quote unquote, inflicted violence on Indians and is therefore incapable of becoming Indian. Bal Gangadhara's curious endeavor to charge Islamic colonizers with damage to Indian intellectual abilities not only uses biological essentialism in the larger context of national and religious identity, but also deprives Islam of intellectuality, mimicking extant presumptions clouded by prejudice. Additionally, whereas reflection on experience by Indians is supposed to have crystallized, quote, theories about people, society, and nature, unquote, influences of Islam is viewed as an invasive force that infiltrates an otherwise intellectual society. Bal Gangadhara's thesis is instructive in understanding the roots that underlie the extension of legal support to statewide institutional ban on hijab. So by arguing that the hijab is not essential to the practice of Islam, the legal apparatus banks on its presumed optionality to render Muslim expression subject to scrutiny, suspicion, and more importantly, policing under the guise of secularism. The hijab ban has already been examined through the lens of Muslim women's rights in arguments that elaborate on state deprivation of choice on grounds of religious expression. It is, however, equally significant to understand the linkages drawn between the recurrent prosecution of the hijab and an increasing acceptance of Hindutva India's distorted history, in which Islamic rule is by default perceived with opposition and which prompts cultural objection to markers associated with Muslim expression. I now move on to the second section in my presentation, which concerns the abuse of feminist reason. So the widespread social sanction on the continuation of the hijab ban in institutions signals yet another danger, which too finds expression in the legal language. Many Indian Hindu supremacists explicitly contend how Muslim women are forced to wear the hijab and that they're deprived of their agency in the conditions created for them. Wendy Brown aptly remarks that such assumptions ignore, quote, the extent to which all choice is conditioned by, as well as imbricated with power, and the extent to which choice itself is an impoverished account of freedom, unquote. In pretending to emerge as feminists, more frequently feminist men, saving Muslim women from Muslim men, Indian Hindu supremacists end up mischaracterizing feminist vocabulary for forwarding their agenda, one which concludes with the establishment of their superiority in contrast to Muslims. And here I want to pause and make a very short note and basically state that, Indian Hindu supremacists don't really perceive or position themselves as superior to Indian Muslims, but rather to Muslims in general. And an underlying acceptance of Islamophobia prevents their acknowledgement of Muslims as Indian, denying Muslims the very Indianness of which Bal Gangadhara speaks. The abuse of feminist reason is not just limited to the social, it extends to the political and the legal as well. In Unbreaking India, Decisions on Article 370 and the CAA, Sanjay Dikshit examines, applauds, and justifies the abrogation of Article 370, which earlier granted the state of Jammu and Kashmir a special status. Amendments to Article 370 required the consent of the government for any presidential order and the consent of the Constituent Assembly of the state for its abrogation. Now, Dikshit argues that the 1965 presidential order and the two other precedents have basically legally allowed the BJP government to bypass the parliament and nullify Article 370. He calls it a quote-unquote brilliant legal strategy. Now, adding on to his praise for this brilliant legal strategy, Dikshit writes, And I quote, Article 35A was a black chapter in the constitutional history of India. It legitimized and institutionalized discrimination against women, refugees, and SC/STs in total disregard of what is now being called constitutional morality by even the Supreme Court of India, unquote. Now, the sudden concern for people from SC/ST caste groups in the larger context of the BJP is well, surprising and interesting, because Modi-led BJP has consistently shown a pattern of disrespect to people from unprivileged caste groups. In October 2016, for instance, the police opened fire on tribal people in the Khunti district in BJP-led Jharkhand when they were on their way to join a protest against attempts at their disenfranchisement. Then hundreds of thousands of tribal people have been evicted from their households. More recently, Union Culture Minister and BJP member G. Kishan Reddy disclosed that the Archaeological Survey of India has conducted a DNA study of 75 tribal communities, the outcome of which can promote eugenicist policies surrounding population control and impact Adivasis' claim to their cultural space. Not to mention the many ways in which violence against women and refugees continues to thrive in legislation. Now, here we can understand the specifics of Dixit's applause by viewing it as a recourse to what is now identified as state feminism, which even Professor Atazia discussed in her talk today. Many liberal feminists, for instance, acknowledge the state violence against Kashmiri women, but they also support the supposition that Kashmiri men are by default militant, which makes them unable to become sensitive to Kashmiri women's subjectivities. The consciousness of difference between the Indian woman and the Kashmiri woman encourages the construction of an implicit culturalist hierarchy that leads to the glorification of the epistemological opacity of the Kashmiri woman, thereby displacing her to the margins of mainstream consciousness. In claiming that Article 35A was a black chapter, Dixit attributes to the larger culture in Kashmir the entire onus of violent discrimination against women, refugees, and people from unprivileged castes. And in doing so, he presents the Indian government as a necessary savior, without whom emancipation for the marginalized in Kashmir would have been impossible. Now, this language of state feminism can help us understand to a certain extent the bail given on supposedly humanitarian grounds to the creators of Bulli Bai and Sulli deals. By making the pretext humanitarian, the court successfully presents itself as an upholder of rights. This may appear implausible, but perhaps the many attempts to simplify bail process of under-trial prisoners in the past 2 decades and an increasing consideration of abolition feminism, which views incarceration with suspicion, can help us understand why the court's decision would actually appear humanitarian to many. There are, of course, 2 reasons why this is questionable. One, the attitude toward is vastly marked by cultural attitudes to religion. For instance, a Kashmiri man named Bashir Ahmad Baba, arrested in Gujarat for allegedly recruiting Muslim men for Pakistani training camps, was acquitted in 2021. After 11 years of imprisonment, the court ruled that there was lack of evidence against the accused, who had been charged with UAPA, which is the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, which is basically used to oppose what is perceived as a threat to national security. In contrast to that case lies the case of the 2 creators of apps that hosted a fake auction of Muslim women. Neither was charged with UAPA. The bail order for one of them justified the bail because the prolonged incarceration of quote-unquote a first-time offender would harm him. So in a broken system, the language of human rights and the court's use of the word humanitarian seems absurd. Secondly, and more importantly, given the role that courts themselves play in policing the enforcement of policy, it's impossible to not link legal systems with the police force in the larger discourse on abolition. I would just now like to conclude and say that Bal Gangadhar Dixit's work provides an intellectual armor to a legacy that is still thriving and continuing of anti-Muslim violence, particularly against Muslim women. The emerging trends in their intellectual conversations mirror, produce, and sanction the many instances of aggressive violence mediated against Muslim women via state, legal, and social authorities, as is evident in the enforcement of the hijab ban and the grant of bail on supposedly humanitarian grounds. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mridula. That was so sort of behind the scenes look at, I would say, what has been happening, which on the surface, like you mentioned, a lot of people have sort of lauded as, a good decision, granting bail on humanitarian grounds by many, even so quote unquote feminists. And thank you for drawing that comparison between state feminism, abolition feminism, and sort of what that looks like and what that could allude to in a system that is broken, in a legal system that favors and isn't as just as you would think. Thank you so much. And again, as I mentioned, we'll talk more during the Q&A. For now, we have our last speaker of this panel, Karthik Shankar. Thank you so much for joining us, Karthik. Karthik is an independent scholar. He's a writer and editor from Chennai, India. He recently finished his master's in comparative literature at SOAS, University of London, on a Chevening scholarship, where he wrote his dissertation on post-colonial transgender categories in Indian English fiction. He was previously an undergraduate writing instructor and a teaching assistant with the Department of English at Ashoka University. Thank you so much for joining us, Karthik. If you would like to share your screen, please do so. If not, let me know and I can help you.
Thanks, Sheelalipi. Just give me a second. I'm gonna hopefully.
While you do that, I'll read out your title of the paper because I forgot.
Yeah.
Feminist Solidarity and Tamil Nationalism in Ummat.
Okay, so 1 second. Can everyone see my screen? Can everyone see the presentation?
Yes, yes.
Okay, great. Okay, so I'm not going to spend too much time, and it's obviously daunting following in the footsteps of Professor Zoya Hasan, but I will give a short overview of Sharmila Saeed's 2014 novel, Ummat. And the title of my presentation has changed multiple times, but the way you might want to think about this presentation is mostly about the role of Muslims and particularly Muslim women within the context of the Tamil liberation movement in Sri Lanka. So Sharmila Saeed's Ummat is a 2014 novel, which was translated into English by Geeta Subramanian in 2018. And it is a social realist novel. And the title obviously derives from Ummah, right? Which is nation or community. And Ummat centers on a number of different female characters. But its center is Tawakkul, who is a Muslim woman and a social worker, much like the novelist Sharmila Saeed herself. And Tawakkul is basically a fearless, So Saeed is basically, Tawakkul is basically a fearless and devoted worker who is engaged in reconstruction after the end of the civil war in Sri Lanka. And what is notable about Saeed's novel is that there have been a number of novels written in Sri Lanka in Tamil, in English, that have delved into the question of what you can call the Tamil problem, right? And there are a number of them, obviously, that have also been written in English or translated into English. So, for instance, you have Shyam Selvature's Funny Boy, you have Anuk Arudpragasham's The Story of a Brief Marriage. But Sharmila Saeed's novel is one of the few that we have that gives access to a very large percentage of the Sri Lankan population, which is the Tamil Muslim population. So what makes Ummat so significant is that it talks about the Tamil liberation movement with the perspective of the Tamil Muslim population. So moving on to the second slide. So I've just given a quote here from the novel, right? So Tawakkul was aware before the 90s Tamils and Muslims had coexisted in harmony. What is extremely interesting about Saeed's novel is that Tamils and Muslims are spoken about as two distinct categories. And this is something that is extremely, this is the case, especially with identity as well in Sri Lanka, right? Because Muslims are seen as a distinct community defined by the religious backgrounds as compared to, say, the Tamils and the Sinhalas. Even though Tamil Muslims make 12.7% of the Sri Lankan population, while Muslims, most of whom are Tamil Muslims, make up 9.7%, Muslims are not necessarily part of the discourse itself around the Tamil liberation movement, even though there have been a number of Muslims in key positions within the LTTE as well, right? So Muslims in Sri Lanka are mostly dispersed in the north and the eastern provinces, right? And Muslims within Tamil discourses are referred to by several different names. One of the polite terms is Islamir, right? But there are less polite ones like Konahar, which comes from the Tamil term Koni, which means wild boar. So obviously there's a large divide already happening between the Tamils and the Muslims, even though in many ways these are overlapping categories. And I will talk about how Sharmila Said also complicates these categories of the Tamil and the Muslim, which are seen largely as unitary categories. So, Ummat, I would argue, falls into a category of what I will just ironically call anti-Tamil literature, right? So I'm not going to read out this lengthy quote, but this appears early on in the novel where Tawakkul's father, Habib, talks about the Elam movement, right? And he says that all the Tamils are left now is with abject misery. And he says that the Tigers picked up arms and brainwashed everybody into believing they were going to achieve freedom. What a farce. So constantly in Ummat, there are discussions about the Tamil liberation movement, in particular how the Tamil liberation movement did not focus on Muslims, how the Tamil liberation movement also inflicted violence on Muslims consistently. And this is an important part in enunciating the novel's point of view, which is that Muslims have a very different role within the Tamil liberation movement in Sri Lanka. And it is through a variety of characters, largely through Tawakkul and through a number of other Muslim characters, including a shopkeeper, including Tawakkul's father, including Tawakkul's mother, that Saeed is able to give a variety of overview of variety of views about the Tamil liberation movement. And importantly, there are two prominent Tamil characters as well in the novel, Tamil Hindu characters, I should say, right? Tevani and Yoga. And it's through them as well that Saeed is also able to talk about how the Tamil liberation movement even fails the Tamil Hindu women among them. So, yeah. In terms of the literary discourse then, how should we understand Said's novel, right? So Said's novel is divided into three parts. And I think it's notable that each part begins with a quote. The first one begins with a quote from the Az-Zukhruf, which is the 43rd chapter of the Quran, and which emphasizes the writer's own religiosity. The second one is from Tagore's epigrammatic collection, Fireflies. And the third one is from a verse from the classic Tamil text, the Tirukkural, which is made up of 1,300 couplets, right? So it's interesting, I think, that these are the literary allusions also that the writer goes for when she's breaking up her book into these chapters, because one is the Quran, right? One is a figure who is central in many ways to cautioning about the deification of nationalism. And the third one is Tirukkural, which is also central to enunciating what Tamil nationalism means. So I'd argue that the novel places itself within several discourses. It places itself within the discourse of Tamil literature and Tamil nationalism. It places itself within the discourse of Islamic modern literature, right? And it also places itself in the vein of the Anglophone literature, right? Represented by people like Tagore, and a transnational kind of Anglophone literature, transnationalism itself. So, myth making. What is extremely interesting about Ummat, and I think most people who read the novel, and especially if you're reading it in the English translation, I'm not going to get into some of the aesthetics of the translation as well, because one thing that Geeta Subramanian has done is she's not retained much of the Sri Lankan dialects, which she mentions upfront, even in her forward to the book in terms of her translation. So what it does though is that I'm sorry, just going back to the previous slide, is that it creates a myth of its own. So let's just look at the first few lines here. Tawakkul was a young woman who had the motivation and courage to seek to identify the problems and do what she could help her war-ravaged country. And at another point, a character says, I don't know why, but ever since I saw you, I feel I have a new confidence in the future. One thing that is extremely interesting about Ummat, particularly in the sections where Tawakkul is featured, is that the novel becomes extremely didactic. And I think this didacticism is interesting because it places this novel within two traditions, right? The first tradition is that of Tamil propaganda literature, right? Tamil propaganda literature that is disseminated through pamphlets, through oral, through songs, through poems, and this propaganda literature that basically felicitates the Tamil symbol, right? The glorious and warriors, both male and female, who are fighting the Sinhala state, right? But it also places it within a different tradition, which is also the moral education literature of the Quran, I think. And I think this didacticism is extremely important for this novel, because within this role, within the novel itself, Said presents Tawakkul and her family as idealized subjects in a sense. They are the ideal Muslim family. They are the Muslim family that all Muslim families should emulate in a certain sense, right? And it's only through this family that she is able to present the harmonizing views that liberal Muslims can play in the political framework of Sri Lanka, particularly in terms of reconstruction after all the destruction that was wreaked by the genocide and the civil war. And the reason for this also is that Said has explained often in her views that literature itself can reform society. So this didacticism clearly has a role in terms of the ways that she thinks that her literature can push forward certain conversations that have happened. And her own life, the fact that she herself is in some ways an exile from her own country, I think gives a little more knowledge or awareness of the ways in which she thinks of literature as well, right? So I would also argue it's through this kind of idealization that Said reverses one of the biggest cultural constructions of Tamil nationalism, that of the valorized Tamil figure. So I will tell you how she does that, right? So one thing that the novel constantly does is that it juxtaposes the Tamil family and the Muslim family. Now, I refer to them as a Tamil family and the Muslim family only to talk about the unitary ways in which these identities are talked about. Obviously, this is a Tamil Muslim family. So one of the main characters in the book is Yoga, who is a amputee and who's a former Tamil tiger who returns to her family and is ill-treated by them, right? So the first quote is about how her mother and sister treat her like an outcast. But there's a section as well later on when she is reflecting on the Tamil tigers themselves, right? And she's talking about, and this is from Yoga's own perspective, not from Tawakkul's perspective, where she says they dragged away little children, chopped off their long hair, made the girls wear trousers and shirts, right? And then you have Tawakkul's own family, which says that our daughter is a nemat to us from, Allah. Basically, she's a blessing. Can anyone raise a daughter as amazing as ours, right? So the centrality of the daughter in the Muslim family versus the daughter being discarded both by the Tamil family and in a sense by the Tamil ethno-state, I think is important to understand of the ways in which Said herself is contrasting and creating space itself for a Muslim family within the Tamil ethno-state of the novel, right? And so this is contrasted with Yoga's family, which does not give any sort of care or affection to her, and which is the very reason why she runs away and joins the LTT in the first place. So I would also argue that it's through juxtaposing the Tamil family and the Muslim family that Said attacks one of the most important tenets itself of Tamil nationalism, which is the idea of filial devotion itself. So filial devotion is an intrinsic element of Tamil liberation movements, and this filial piety for people like Prabhakaran was based on Bhakti and Sangam poetry traditions, and it was used to ferment support for the Tamil homeland. And this is constantly a part of the ways in which that the Tamil liberation movement also created these hierarchies of support for their leaders, right? And Ummat instead reverses this idea of filial piety, right? Because at the end of the novel, the martyrdom, which is a key part of Tamil filial devotion, is achieved by Habib, because Tawakkul's own father is murdered by some men who are angry about the social work that his daughter is undertaking. And in this way, this novel posits that a different form of nationhood could be possible, right? One in which progressive forward-looking values are possible, only fathers follow their daughters. So what it does, I think, as Sri Lankan historian Michael Roberts has said about filial piety, is that it it takes filial piety, which is a key tenet of the Tamil liberation movement, and it upturns this idea of filial piety. There are constant conversations even within Ummat about how parents should be listening to their children as opposed to and their daughters as opposed to daughters following in the footsteps of their parents. So there is a feminist reversal that happens, an Islamic feminist reversal that happens, that talks about that instead talks about new ways of understanding, I would say, nationhood, or even what it could mean to progress as well. So patriarchy and statelessness. So we have now spoken about filial piety. We have spoken about Tamil ethno-state. So one thing that Ummat does, which is also interesting, is that the state in Ummat is not necessarily represented by the Sinhala state alone, right? Because we have the Tamil ethno-state. The violence that we are constantly understanding within the framework of the novel is the violence that is conducted by the Tamil liberation movement, right? But it's also the violence of patriarchy. So here I've put in two quotes, right? It isn't right to blame the entire community for one or two bad apples. This is where Tawakkul talks about the patriarchs, the Muslim patriarchs who try to prevent her from engaging in her work because they think that she's demonizing Islam, right? And there's another conversation where she talks to a man with whom she's soon to be engaged, and he tries to force her into ordering something, and she says only when there's no question of force between two people that they'll be able to live in peace and harmony. So in many ways, the novel itself understands the relationship between the Tamil Hindu and the Tamil Muslim as something of a question of force, and this force also intersects in many ways with patriarchy, right? And at the end of the novel, it is patriarchy that is the main unifier itself between Tawakkul and Yoga. Yoga is sexually assaulted by an uncle. She tries to kill herself. She's discarded by the LTT. And Tawakkul herself has her father murdered simply because she is a woman who engages in public facing work. So statelessness then is something that has to be considered not just within the context of the Sinhala state, but something that can be fomented through non-state actors as well, right? Through fundamentalists, through religious fundamentalists, through liberation movements as well. So we're just going to the final sections quickly. So as I mentioned, identity in Sri Lanka is far from homogeneous, but I use Tamil, Muslim, and Sinhala, obviously in unitary terms, but also in many ways, they do become unitary characteristics, right? And it's interesting also to talk about the Ummah as well, right? Because one thing that Saeed is responding to within the novel is the idea of Muslims within Sri Lanka, Tamil Muslims taking on characteristics of a global Ummah, and her own critique of it as well. So, and through Tawakkul, Saeed establishes a liberalism that trespasses across unitary identities. And she talks about how humanitarian work has no racial or linguistic identities. I'm quickly going to get to the last section. So we have Islamic feminist resistance. And this first quote, which I'm not going to read, where she criticizes the practice of wearing a headdress and facial veil as an Arab custom, is one of the ways in which she criticizes the idea of an ummah that's based on a global Islam, right? But she still, throughout the novel though, Saeed and even Tawakkul constantly is a religious person. She constantly believes that Allah has a plan, right? And even at the end, her uncle tells her that Allah will lift you up, and to teach those who think that your story is over, not just yours, should rise stronger than ever, so strong that no one should come to you. So the feminist resistance within the novel is placed within a framework of Islamic feminist resistance. And this Islamic feminist resistance is a different pathway as well, I argue, than the ones that the Tamil liberation movement has in a way set up in terms of Tamil identity within Sri Lanka. And Saeed has, through this novel, shown a different path towards that Muslim category that doesn't align itself either with the Tamil or the Sinhala, nor Muslim fundamentalism, but an Islamic feminism. And that brings me to the end of my presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Karthik. That was also fascinating. I'm curious to read the book. I haven't read. Obviously, I will be reading in translation, but I can't wait. And I think something that you sort of began and sort of concluded with this idea of the Tamil and the Muslim being sort of juxtaposed and contradictory sort of identities, as opposed to being able to coexist within an individual, I think is something also that Mridula sort of brought up when she spoke about the Hindu man sort of competing against this transnational Muslim, as opposed to sort of the politics of the individualized Indian Muslim. I think similarly here with the Tamil Muslim woman as identity as something that is almost unthinkable in that sense. If you are sort of if you're not able to write them together, that means you're sort of erasing that identity. And I think it's interesting in the way that, as you mentioned, the author sort of critiques that and brings that up. And thank you so much once again.